Well, hello, everyone, and welcome back to another Sunday School review where we're going to jump into the Word of God and see what we can pull out and how the Word of God applies to our everyday life. And it does apply to everything, and we can apply it to everything that we do. Today is not going to be any different. Today, we're going to talk about a subject of faith in times of trouble. Faith in times of trouble. And coming from James chapter 6, verse 10 and 11, drops down to verse 14, then down to 16, down to 19 through 23, then 26 through 27. And what do you do when you have something that is so big and so troublesome and so worrisome? What do you do in a case like that when there's no way out? Nobody in power or authority can help you get out of it, and you just seem to be there by yourself. How do you deal with that? Well, Daniel found himself in a situation. I don't think he was worried. I don't think he was troubled either, because he knew the God that he served, and he made it real clear to the authority that he's going to stay on the Lord's side. So we're going to kind of start right there, and I'm going to kind of begin with four opening questions. How is daily prayer beneficial to your relationship with God? Number one. How can you ensure that prayer isn't just checking off the box? Okay, I've done that today. And also number three, what is the greatest wonder God has worked in your life? And how would telling this wonder help believers and unbelievers if you told them some of the things you've had to deal with? And so, with that being said, let's kind of get right into that first part of our lesson, which is violations and consequences. And I'm going to read just that part of our lesson, and we'll get into the other parts. Now, when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went into his house, and his windows being open in the chamber toward Jerusalem. He knelt upon his knees 3 times a day, and prayed, and gave thanks before his God, as he did aforetime. Then these men assembled, and found Daniel praying and making supplications before his God. Verse 14. Then the king, when he heard these words, was sore displeased with himself, and set his heart on Daniel to deliver him, and he labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him. Then the king commanded, and they brought Daniel and cast him into the den of lions. Now the king spake and said unto Daniel, Thy God, whom thou servest continually, he will deliver thee. The second part of our lesson is release and vindication. So let's read that part. Then the king arose very early in the morning and went in haste unto Daniel unto the den of lions. And when he came to the den, he cried with a lamentable voice unto Daniel. And the king spake and said to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, is thy God, whom thou servest continually, able to deliver thee from the lions? Then Daniel said unto the king, O king, live forever. My God hath sent his angel and shut the lion's mouth. They have not hurt me, for as much as before him innocency was found in him, and also before thee, O king, have I done no hurt. Then was the king exceeding glad for him, and commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no manner of hurt was found upon him, because he believed in his God. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom men tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, and steadfast forever, and his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall be even unto the end. He delivered and rescued, and he worked signs and wonders in heavens and in earth, who had delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. It's important to know that no power in heaven or on earth can stand against the Lord's purpose. No power wherever it may be, can stand against the Lord's purpose. That leads to the rest of our lessons. I'm gonna pull that part down and get into just a little bit of commentary and of this lesson, and then we're gonna kind of go from there. I'm gonna read just a little bit about a commentary. If I can get my so let's pull that down real quick. Very, very powerful lesson, one that I think all of us, well, I know all of us at some point, whether we can remember it or not, we've dealt with trouble in some capacity, and where you say, Lord have mercy, I don't know, what did I do to deserve this? How did I get myself into this? And then sometimes it's not that you got yourself into it, it's the way life works. And life sometimes can bring certain trouble, certain kind of problems that if we are not prepared for it, when it comes, you just have to deal with it when it comes. And then sometimes what's amazing about that kind of trouble, that you have to learn to lean. There's a song that learning to lean on Jesus. You have to learn to lean on him quickly, because the problem, they ain't gonna wait for you to get ready. Sometimes things happen in life to where you either ready or not, here it comes. And so I don't think Daniel saw this coming, but when it did come, he was prepared because he had the Lord on his side. I'm gonna read a little. Well, I'm not going to get into a lot of other stuff. I'm going to just get a little context and get right on into our lesson today. Today's study has as its backdrop the appointment of 120 princes under the oversight of 3 presidents, including Daniel. The king knew of Daniel's reputation and preferred him over all the other presidents and princes, and he sought to set Daniel over the whole realm. So Daniel got a big promotion because he had God on his side. He had the favor of God on him. But jealousy among Daniel's peers led them to scheme. A lot of jealousy when you start doing well. Jealousy can creep up and you'll be surprised where it comes from. But they schemed against him, and they tried to find fault in Daniel, but they couldn't find any grounds to file any charges against him. So instead, what they did, they developed a trap that the king Darius couldn't overturn, and he didn't see it coming. So that plan encouraged King Darius, to establish a statute, a law, that whoever should pray to any other deity or man except the king for 30 days was going to be thrown into a den of hungry, ferocious lions. So prayer for back at that time, prayer for a monarch was standard in the ancient Near East. But prayer to a monarch was exceptional. And so here's what they wanted them to do, to pray to the king. So furthermore, the officials then maneuvered the king to issue a decree, to issue a law, according to the laws of the Medes and the Persians, which could not be altered, could not be changed. So there was very little that Darius could do to prevent the enforcement of the statute after it had been signed into writing as a decree. And so it looked pretty bad for Daniel. And that brings us to what we are, to our lesson, our first verse in our lesson today, in verse number 10, Daniel 6, 10 and 11, is talking about Daniel's prayer. Daniel's prayer. And so I'm gonna kind of stick with the notes from our International Sunday School Commentary, and not all the notes, but just quite a few of them. In verse 10, we see that Daniel kneeled upon his knees, not 1, not 2, but 3 times every day. And he also experienced a high level of, Daniel did, of power. He had a high level of prestige. He had a lot of wealth, because Daniel was an appointed, not an elected, an appointed official of the king in the king's administration. You read about this in Daniel chapter 6, verses 1 through 3. And houses in ancient Babylon would have had a flat rooftop, and that rooftop functioned as another room or a patio that they could go up there and relax and chill. And in Daniel's case, he could go up and pray. At the dedication of Solomon's temple, the Lord commanded the people to pray, but to pray toward Jerusalem and pray toward the temple in Jerusalem at various times when they was in trouble. You read about this in 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 35 to 38, and throughout the book of 1 Kings chapter 8. But in verse 11, we read that the men who pushed the king, who pushed Darius to pass that decree that only the king was the one that was going to be worshiped during that time. These are the men that did that. Open windows made catching Daniel pretty easy, because Daniel just opened the windows and prayed. You know, he wasn't trying to pray in private, you know, pray in secret. That Daniel prayed wide open. And so praying and making supplications before his God was a habit for Daniel. How many of us got a praying habit? Well, we pray all the time, not just when there's trouble. We should all consider that. Verse 14, we see Darius had a problem. The king, there was a problem. And in 14, the phrase, these words, refer to what you read in Daniel chapter 6, verses 12 through 15. The king's official reminded Darius, the king, of what he had signed, of this decree, this law. And then they reported, was a tattletale, so to speak, on Daniel's praying habits. Now, king, let me just make sure you remember what you signed. But look at what Daniel's doing. So the king didn't realize that he had been naively manipulated by these officials in their scheme against Daniel, their jealousy, insecurity against Daniel. And the king had failed to see the underlining reason that these officials came to him with all, as if they had all this respect and oh my goodness, you're the king. Let's everybody pray to you. And that was an alterative motive. Always look out for a person's motives when they start praising you and saying, you ain't nobody like you. Can't nobody do it like you. Don't you fall for that. Okay, don't you feed on that. So the king then labored, went to work to try to get Daniel out of this trouble, because it looked like it was humanly impossible. And it was a humanly impossible situation. But because of the laws of the Medes and the Persians, the king couldn't just, well, I changed my mind. We ain't going to do it that way. He couldn't do it. Because you want to read about this in Esther chapter 8, verses number 8. Now we see the den's predators, the predators that was inside the den. In verse 16a, if Darius did not approve the punishment, if he didn't go on to carry through what he had signed into law, number one, it's going to be disrespectful to his culture. He was going to be disrespectful to the law because he was going to break the law, lose respect, lose confidence, the confidence of the people, because here's a king that ain't keeping his word. So he had regrettably had to command that Daniel be fed to the lions, cast him in the lion den, and the lions, when you and some wild, hungry lions, you know, it ain't gonna be good for you. And the second part of verse 16b, the king spake unto Daniel and said, thy God whom thou servest continually, which is consistently, not a break-in service with Daniel and God. He served them all the time. He said, he's going to deliver you. He's going to take care of you. Now, this is what the king said. So Darius, the king, likely practiced something called polytheism, which is a belief of not just one God, not just two or three, but many gods. And so he just kind of had the one true and living God in the list. Okay, he didn't see him as the one true and only living God, thy God whom thou serve. So even if he believed in the same God that Daniel served, as I mentioned, he didn't believe he was the only one. Now we get into section 2, which is release and vindication. And in verse 19, we're still a question here. In verse 19, we can clearly see, after reading this verse, that the king didn't sleep all night long. He worried, tossed and turned all night long, because he knew that Daniel was, the next morning, Daniel was going to be ripped to threads. In his mind, he's going to be torn apart. So this was a very close guy. He was very close to Daniel. But the next morning, he got up real early. You read about it, and went to the mouth the mouth of the den of lions. And that the den had been sealed with the royal signet and the signet of other officials. His royal signet and the signet of other officials, so they couldn't undo it. You read about this in Daniel chapter 6, verse 17 to 18. So, as we stated earlier, no one could break the seal. No one. No elected officials. If the king couldn't do it, nobody else definitely couldn't do it. That Daniel was for Daniel's fate. And so the only way for Daniel to make it through the night, God was going to have to intervene. God himself or one of God's representatives, one of God's officials was going to have to come in and save Daniel. So as Darius arrived at the lion's den the next morning very early, he called out with a real loud, desperate voice, "Daniel!" A lamentable voice, a voice of sorrow, "Daniel!" He didn't know what to expect, but he went there that morning, he cried out, assuming that he was going to call his name and he wasn't going to answer. A person dies, you can call their name and they're not going to answer. So Darius felt that I've lost my most trusted president. He was one of them. Daniel was. Had prestige and power, and he had wealth. But when he came against what they put out there because he wanted to stand for God, all that was in jeopardy. In verse 20, the king addressed Daniel, the way the king addressed Daniel revealed something. Revealed that the king was developing an understanding of the one true God. Whether he had developed it completely, but he was developing an understanding. And the idols, because the idol was unable to give life, that the other gods that he served could not give life. And now Darius recognized that the God of Daniel was the living God, the one that had life, not made by the hands of man with stone and silver or gold or wood. This is the one true God that was living. So even the other presidents and the princes had to acknowledge something. They had to acknowledge that Daniel there was no fault found in this man. They couldn't find any fault in Daniel. And not only that, Daniel was not just trustworthy, the commentary says entirely trustworthy. He behaved as a servant of the living God, Daniel did. After all this has happened, he still showed honor and he still showed respect to the king. Isn't that amazing? Daniel had a whole nother level of maturity. Daniel took the high road on a whole nother level. So now we see in verse 21 and 23, we see the innocent. In verse 21, even though Daniel's lion den situation was because of an oversight of the king that did not have enough insight or wisdom or discernment to see this scheme, Daniel still greeted that king with respect and honor. You read about it in verse 21, "O king, live forever." Isn't that something? So in verse 22, Daniel's testimony was that his survival was a result of an intervention from God. God sent an angel. I want to read Psalms 34 and 7 real quick, if I can take just a minute to do that. Psalm 34 and 7. "For the angel of the Lord is a guard." Did y'all hear that? "He surrounds and defends all who fear him." Folks don't believe that the Lord sends angels to help us in times of trouble, but the Lord does send an angel. Oftentimes I pray for my daughter. I said, "Lord, pray for, to keep in touch." And then in my mind, and I believe this, I can assign angels because they are sent to minister to God's people, to each one of us. We can't see them, and every now and then the Lord would allow them to be seen. But that's a benefit of the kingdom. I'm telling you right now. You don't have to believe it. That's the benefit of the kingdom. So Daniel also noted that he survived because he was what? He ain't done no wrong. He was innocent. Innocent before God. He ain't done no wrong before God. No wrong before the king. Okay, so God honored that. So Daniel didn't live. Now let me go on and say this. Daniel wasn't a perfect man. Like ain't nobody on this that in this class is perfect. If you think you perfect, that's one indication you ain't perfect. Okay, so he wasn't a perfect man, but he claimed he was innocent right here because he had followed. Look at what he did. He followed God faithful, and he followed God's law faithfully. Now we look at verse 23. In verse 23, the king's biggest fear was removed. And the word that the king had a lot of worry because he thought Daniel was going to be ripped to pieces. That word at an instant was changed to joy and gladness when he saw with his own eyes how God could work and God could deliver, and God had delivered his friend and one of his officials in his administration, one of his presidents, Daniel. You see, God can turn things around just like that and turn worry into joy at an instant. Man, so anyone who remains, not just claim, but remains faithful to God now in the midst of trouble and suffering and pain, they've been promised something, eternal rewards. I'm going to read Revelation chapter 2 and verse 10 real quick. Don't be afraid. I'm going to read this in the New Living Translation as well. Don't be afraid of what you're about to suffer. The devil will throw some of you into prison to test you. You will suffer for 10 days, but if you remain faithful, even when facing death, I will give you the crown of life. Now, we should all thank God that none of us in North America has to deal with what they dealt with back in the biblical times. There are certain parts around the world, though, that they don't have this freedom to worship the one true and living God that we have. And they have lined in situations and as commonplace. When we are so blessed, there are public displays of faithfulness will have a transforming effect on the community and in those that are elected to run the community, the town, state, government, country. If we're not secret agents, we praise him and let the whole world know that he's our God. Verse 26, we see the decree in verse 26 and 8. After observing how God had saved Daniel from these ferocious lions, Darius made another command. Y'all go get that setup crew, that group that set Daniel up. Go get him, go get them, go get their wives and we said back home, all the children. And I want y'all to throw every one of them guys, their wives and their whole families into the den of lions. Them lions just had a game with them, just sport with them, and broke all the bones and just tore them to pieces. So what they meant to happen to Daniel, end up happening to them. Be careful of the seed that you sow, because we're gonna reap now just what we sow. We ain't gonna sow no butter beans and get no corn. And so those guys end up losing their entire family because of what they tried to do to Daniel. And Darius went on to write a decree. This is another decree. All people, all nations, all languages that dwell in all the earth, y'all gonna worship that God that Daniel served. Because he's the one. He's the main one. He's the one true and living God. So Darius decreed, legislated. It was law that all the people fear the God of Daniel. And then listen to this, coming from the mouth of a pagan king, this was a pretty big deal. It brought in a whole nother degree of respect for the one true and living God, okay? And as well as for not only the one true and living God, but for God's people that serve the one true and living God. And then we see also in verse 26 and B, the decree included a lot of reasons why the king felt and his subjects should fear God. Number one, Daniel's God is the living God. This is a pagan king that was saying this, okay? So we see a developing, as I mentioned earlier, developing understanding. And he alone, Daniel's God, can give life and livelihood. The other thing they were worshiping, which is They can do nothing. You can burn them up, tear them up, break them all up. They didn't have no life, could not give life. Number two, unlike the earthly kingdoms such as the Babylonians, Persians, the Romans, any kind of so-called superpower, they was gonna come to an end. But God's kingdom, number one, look what this king said: ain't gonna never be destroyed, and ain't gonna never end. So the king had come to a really good understanding. Now we got to bring this thing to a close. And as a matter of fact, let's I want y'all to go back and read Psalms 145 and 13. In verse 27, the decree also emphasized something. Emphasized how God had done some miraculous works. He did it for his people. And this wasn't the only time that God did this. God did it. He did it often. He did it for Daniel. He had done it for a lot of other of his people throughout the annals of time. So I'm gonna read Jeremiah. I'm gonna read Jeremiah 32. I'm gonna read this a little bit more reading here, and 19 through 22. I'm gonna read it in the New Living Translation. You have all wisdom, and do great and mighty miracles. You see the conduct of all people, and you give them what they deserve. You perform miraculous signs and wonders in the land of Egypt. Things still remember to this day. And you have continued to do great miracles in Israel and all around the world. You have made your name famous to this day. You brought Israel out of Egypt with mighty signs and wonders, with a strong hand and a powerful arm, and with overwhelming terror. You gave the people of Israel this land that you had promised their ancestors long before, a land flowing with milk and honey. That's the God that we serve. In class, I would encourage you to stay on his side. He got a good track record. He's never failed, and he ain't gonna start failing now. Okay, so whatever situation you may find yourself in, this is not belittling your situation. All of us have had trouble. We've had heartache and pain. We've had circumstances and situations that we were faced that we had no idea. How in the world are we gonna deal with this? How are we gonna pay that? How are we gonna take care of that? How are we gonna get over this? Because this was said by a medical doctor. This was said by a loan officer. My employer said they're gonna close it down. The son said he's through with his daddy. The daughter said she ain't want nothing else to do with her parents. How are we gonna deal with this? God. He listen to this. He didn't bring you this far to leave you. And he ain't gonna leave you now. But we've got to learn to lean on Jesus. Now I said we got to learn to lean. And what we've learned to lean on down through the past is learn to lean on the arm of flesh, or to lean on man, to lean on, again, the job, to lean on the education, to lean on your networking contacts, your networking skill. God is above all that. God holds the whole world in his hand. He's in total control. He's sovereign. He's almighty. He has all knowledge. He has all power, and he's everywhere at the same time. Hey, that's the God. I'm going to stay on that side, and I would encourage you to do the same thing. Hey, look, y'all have a great rest of the week. Thank you for plugging into our Sunday School Review. We look forward to seeing you again next week for our Sunday School Review. Y'all take care.